Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at Harvard Kennedy School. I'm Doug Elmendorf. Tonight's event is titled From Harvard to the White House and State Department, Perspectives on Public Service. This week is Public Service Week at the Kennedy School. For nearly a decade now, the school has each year in a week focused our collective energy and enthusiasm on the rewards and responsibilities of public service. And there'll be a set of events over the course of the week. On Friday is our day of service. My wife and I will be out helping to clean up the riverbanks. There are a number of activities around the school. I want to thank our Student Public Service Collaborative for their hard work in arranging these events. I want to thank the Institute of Politics for arranging tonight's session in the forum and so many exciting sessions in the forum over the course of a year. We're very lucky tonight to be joined by Sarah Hurwitz and Jon Finer. They are both Harvard College graduates. They are both now resident fellows at the Institute of Politics. Let me say a few words about them, and then I'll get to ask them some questions, and then you'll get to ask them some questions. Jon started his career at the Washington Post, where he served as a foreign and national correspondent. He spent 18 months in Iraq. He was there for covering the US invasion in 2003, back again in 2005 and 2006. He covered a number of other conflicts as well. The fighting with Israel and Lebanon in 2006, Russia and Georgia in 2008, and in Gaza in 2009. Jon became a White House Fellow in 2009, worked in the White House Chief of Staff's office and the National Security Council staff. He became the senior advisor to the Deputy National Security Advisor, and then moved over to the State Department, where he was in turn the Deputy Chief of Staff, the Director of Policy Planning, and ultimately the Chief of Staff to Secretary John Kerry. Sarah was a lawyer in Washington, I learned, at least a little while, and then moved quickly into speech writing for public leaders. She wrote speeches in the 2004 election cycle for Wesley Clark and John Kerry, in 2007 for Hillary Clinton. She worked on Michelle Obama's speech for the Democratic National Convention in 2008, and then joined the White House team, serving as a senior speechwriter for President Barack Obama, and then as the chief speechwriter for First Lady Michelle Obama. You traveled widely with the First Lady. Sarah worked on Michelle Obama's 2012 and 2016 convention speeches, and was advisor to the White House Council on Women and Girls, among other activities. So we could not ask for two greater examples of public service than the two people that are joining me here tonight. As I say, I get to ask them some questions to start with, but then it will be your turn as well. So let me begin by asking each of you in turn how you got to where you are now. How did you both started, I think, as lawyers with legal training, ended up with very distinguished careers in public service already in your lives. Did you envision this path? Was it planned, or was it sort of an accident? How did you get here, and how did you think about it as you were going along?
I'm always suspicious of the people who can write their 5-year plan on a napkin. That usually doesn't pan out. I think my career is proof of that. I interned in Vice President Gore's speechwriting office the summer of 1998, and I interned for some great speechwriters, and those guys actually helped me get my first jobs out of college, which was as the assistant for a speechwriter in state government in Maryland, a job which lasted 9 months. I was commuting 3 hours a day round trip, sitting in a windowless cubicle next to a bathroom. Didn't go well. My next job was actually as a speechwriter for Senator Tom Harkin, wonderful senator from Iowa. I didn't know how to write speeches, though, and by the end of the year, his chief of staff was so thrilled to hear I was thinking about law school and just really urged me to go to law school. And when I was in law school, I met a guy named Josh Gottheimer, who is now a Democratic congressman from New Jersey, and he had been a speechwriter for President Clinton, and the two of us actually speech wrote together. We freelanced, and Josh was kind of the one who taught me how to write speeches. And so, he got called to work on Wes Clark's campaign, our 3rd year of law school, and I followed him down there. We actually just kind of skipped a semester of classes, flew back for exams, perhaps not the wisest strategy, but it was okay, we passed. And then we worked for Kerry. Those were 2 losing campaigns. Then I did work in a law firm, and then Josh actually called me after a couple years of working in a law firm, and he said, Hillary Clinton is looking for a chief speechwriter. Do you want to apply? I think you should do it. And I said, no, I'm not qualified. She's so amazing. I don't have enough experience, which is kind of funny because I've been a deputy chief speechwriter for 2 presidential candidates at this point. Said no. He called again a month later. I said no again. He called again a month later, and he said, seriously, they're still looking. Really, they have a couple candidates. Maybe you can be co-chief speechwriters with someone else. So I said yes, and then I got the job, and Josh called me and he said, okay, you got the job. They decided not to do this co-chief speechwriter thing, so it's just you. And then did that, and Hillary lost. So that's now 3 losing campaigns. That's, a failed job in speechwriting. That's like 2 years at a law firm. This doesn't add up to an amazing resume, but then I got called to work for Barack Obama, and he won. And that really sort of changed the trajectory of my career because I got to go to the White House. I got to have these amazing experiences writing for the 2 of them. So I think, the upshot, honestly, is a number of failures, a lot of good luck, and just a lot of tremendous hard work.
So, like Sarah, I guess I should start by saying the last job I had at the State Department, Secretary Kerry's Chief of Staff and the Director of the Office of Policy Planning, and that was, my friends like to point out, the first time in my life that planning was actually a daily part of my existence. I am not a planner. I tend to book flights 2 hours before they take off. So that goes for my career trajectory as well. I ended up in journalism almost totally by accident, and I'm starting with journalism because I actually considered that to be a public service job just as much, frankly, as my time in government was. But I ended up doing it totally by accident. I had gone to Harvard as an undergrad. I had done a master's degree after that and was planning to go to law school, but it just seemed like a lot of school all in a row. So I ended up moving to Hong Kong. I worked at a magazine, English language magazine based there for a year and realized I actually enjoyed the writing that I was doing. So I came back and started working at the Washington Post. Through the course of covering sort of one conflict after another, which takes a toll, I started to get interested in and concerned about how foreign policy decisions get made, and probably somewhat naively started to wonder if they could be made better. If being involved in them, I could help somehow make them better based on the experiences that I'd had overseas. So that's what led me to want to go and work in the administration. But I had not worked on the 2008 presidential campaign. I was in law school at the time. I was excited about
going to class, I hope.
Going to class occasionally. Excited about Barack Obama. Excited about Hillary Clinton too in the primary. And actually sort of didn't even really pick a side. I was still a journalist. But when Barack Obama got elected, I decided I really wanted to work in the administration, but I didn't really know how one goes about doing that. So the way I got in was I applied for this fellowship called a White House Fellowship, which is actually explicitly designed for people who are outside of government to come in, ideally for a year, and then go back to what you were doing before. So I got the fellowship. I went in, having been in law school before, I had nothing really to return to, and decided I was going to try to stick it out in the administration, and ended up staying much longer than I intended.
I would echo both your comments about the role of happenstance and opportunities coming at certain times in one's life, right? I can look back in my career, and I can tell the story looking back, but at the time, I had no idea what was going to happen. And lots of things came up that ended up making huge differences, right? And you have to be ready, and you have to work when the opportunities come. But you also need them to come at the right times. So both of you had jobs in which you worked very closely with specific prominent people. Different, for example, from my experience in government. So you, particularly with the First Lady, you with the Secretary of State, and I'm sure both of them wanted to hear your perspectives on the issues at hand, but also there must have been parts of the job where you needed to channel them, in giving them words to say or directions to go in, acting as they wanted you to act. How did you think about that? How did you absorb some part am I thinking about this right? That you had to absorb some part of them. How did you do that?
Well, speechwriting in particular is a very intimate job. I think people often say to me, oh, so you just write something and then they read it. It could not be further from the truth, especially for someone like Michelle Obama. This is a woman who knows who she is, and she always knows what she wants to say. So my job as a speechwriter is to really it's to channel her. It's to really understand, where is her head at? What is she thinking? What does she need? there's a great, someone once told me sort of the art of being a good staffer, it's the art of anticipation. It's sort of figuring out what is she going to need at this moment. And so, working with her was a lot about sitting down with her before even writing and saying, what do you want to say? What are you thinking? Really kind of asking her questions to just draw that out and trying to kind of channel her most authentic voice. Because I think, more than anything else, I think she is defined by this relentless authenticity. She is always who she is. I think this is why people like her so much. She will never say something she doesn't truly, deeply believe. And so the job of someone who works for her is always being on top of that, really being aware of that. And she had an amazing staff who facilitated that process. So I think that was a key part of working for her.
So just picking up on what you said just before you asked that question about the role of happenstance, I would say the other key ingredient in a career trajectory that's satisfying is having a good boss along the way and good people to sort of pick you up and pull you along, particularly in government, which career trajectories are so arbitrary and so ad hoc that having someone who you really respect and admire, and I think we've both been very lucky in that regard. As a chief of staff, you sort of have two jobs that make up the job, and they point in two different directions. So one points up to the principal, to the boss, as you described, and that job involves both having the trust of the person you work for, and for me, that was a bit of a challenge initially because I didn't know Secretary Kerry. He had been in public life for more than 30 years, and he had a lot of people who had worked with him throughout that time, and I was not one of those people. So I met him when I came over and interviewed. I also had the challenge of being new to the State Department when I started this job. And so that's the other direction, is one of the directions is pointing up and making sure you're getting the boss what they need, making sure they are their best self, because even these people who've been in public life forever and know all the issues, they're only going to be right 80, 90, whatever it is, percentage of the time, and the rest of the time you have to help kind of shape things in the proper direction. The other part of the job is taking whatever it is the boss's sort of vision for policy, for management, for the organization, and then conveying that to the rest of the institution, because somebody like the Secretary of State can only interact with a certain number of people on a given day. A lot of that you have to pick up for them, both keeping issues from them that they don't need to worry themselves with, but also making sure the rest of the people in the institution who are out actually doing the day in, day out work know what the Secretary's views are. So you're sort of focused up, you're focused laterally, you're focused down all at one time.
Yep. Let me probe a little more on each of those issues. So on speechwriting, when I first started working in economic policy, and when I taught here for a while, I went to work at the Federal Reserve Board. And my view, I think like many economists at my level at the time, was that the hard thing about public policy is getting the right answer. And then, by the way, there's a little minor addendum of telling somebody why that's the right answer and why they should believe you. And then as I went on a bit in government, I realized that was wrong. So I ended up at the Council of Economic Advisors in the Treasury Department, and where I was in interagency processes or in a department with people with very different sorts of backgrounds. And they wanted to they weren't interested in my quoting some economists. They wanted to hear some more generally interesting and compelling narrative, and they were trying to tell a story to members of Congress or to folks back home or something else. So over time, it became clearer to me just how important the process was of telling the story. What is it we're trying to accomplish and why, and how does some specific policy that some character like me has thought up fit into that broader objective? So how do you think about that when you were working for the president, working for the first lady? So I don't think I'm good at that. I'm good at doing some bit of analysis. I'm less good. This matters a bit actually for my role here at the Kennedy School. So I'm struggling with this now, is how to put the little pieces together into a broader story. Can you say a little bit?
Right. I mean, this is something that speechwriters often wrestle with, where we're going to write a speech about, let's say, healthcare policy, and you sit down with a healthcare policy person. They say, okay, you have to put all 27 of these points in the speech, or it'll be a disaster, and this person will be mad, and they're so sort of deep in their weeds. They know their weeds. They know their weeds are right, and they kind of feel really intense that you must say all of these things. And it's really your job as a speechwriter to say, okay, the president or the first lady, they're not going to want to say all of those weeds because that's not very compelling. That's not actually telling a story about how this policy impacts someone's life. That's always the story. You're always trying to think about, okay, if I'm a person affected by this policy, what's it going to feel like in my life? What's it going to look like? Taste like? Just how is it going to change my life? And that's the story you're trying to tell. So my job is to kind of pick out all of these sort of the details that you are kind of overwhelming me with, and kind of create a narrative and create a story out of them. But I will tell you, it's so important for us to work with policy folks because you are the ones who tell us, hey, that's not right. I mean, we were so concerned in the Obama White House with getting things correct. We had the most elaborate fact-checking process. Every single line of every single speech I wrote in 8 years was fact-checked by a team of people in our research department who, if they could not independently verify something, they immediately went to the policy team. They immediately did secondary research. I mean, they were really concerned about getting this right. So it is a collaboration between the policy people who have the facts and the message people who need to weave that facts into a story that's going to move ordinary folks who don't necessarily know the weeds.
So I suspect you'd agree with this, Doug, but tell me if not. There is a fundamental tension, I think, between what makes good policy, and some of that is understanding complexity and nuance, and what makes good explanation of policy, which often tends to be things that do not have a lot of complexity and nuance. And so that, when you're working on something that's big and complicated, makes it very hard because getting it right inside the room is very different from how you get it right when you're telling the public or telling Congress. The best example of this that I have is the Iran nuclear deal. So that is a massively complicated, 100-plus page document that had thousands of other pages of research and background documents and appendices and everything else behind it. It involved technical experts on legal issues, on sanctions, on nuclear science, involving our national laboratories all over the country and things that. So there was really no one person who could understand the entirety of this deal. So then you have to take something like that that's only been distilled down to about 120, whatever it was, pages, and try to explain to the public why this is a good thing when people who are against it are out there saying very simple things about why it's bad, like it allows Iran to enrich uranium, it gives them some number of billions of dollars they can use for bad things. Whereas, the arguments that we initially kicked around when we were trying to decide how to sell this, are not always easily digestible. Well, they go from 19,000 centrifuges to 5,000 centrifuges. Well, okay, what can you do with 5,000 centrifuges? They go from thousands of kilograms of enriched uranium to 300 kilograms of enriched uranium. Okay, well, what can you do with that? So we developed simpler and better arguments that we ended up using when we were going up to the Hill and explaining it in speeches. Things like, well, the alternative to this nuclear deal very well might have been a war with Iran. How do people feel about another US conflict in the Middle East? The alternative to this nuclear deal, with the deal, Iran will have a year between when it starts to try to get a nuclear weapon, if it starts to try to get a nuclear weapon, and when it actually achieves enough fissile material to get a nuclear weapon. Without the deal, that time is 2 or 3 months. So distilling very complicated arguments down to simpler arguments that people can understand ends up making it much easier to sell.
Also, just to add on to that, I think an example from the First Lady that, when she announced her childhood obesity initiative, we got some real criticism from people saying this is the nanny state, this is her telling people what to feed their children. And I think if we'd gone on and on with a bunch of statistics about public health and the important, medical bills and this and that, it's like that doesn't really hit. But the way that she tended to talk about this was like, what, if you're a mom or a dad or caretaker of a kid and you are trying so hard to feed your kid decent food, and then they go to school and they get this school lunch that has no nutrition that your taxpayer dollars are paying for, like, how do you feel about that? Parents should have control over what they're feeding their kids. It was sort of a narrative that was really about them, seeing it through their eyes, as opposed to this kind of like abstract kind of statistics or things that just don't really resonate with folks.
One thing I've seen is my wife and I saw a play in Washington that was called Sweat, and it was about a community that's basically destroyed because its manufacturing work goes elsewhere. And I think about these issues a lot, and I think about them with charts and tables and so on. But even for me, it was quite moving to sit. This was a little theater. There were 6 or 8 actors on the stage. They were 25 feet away. And it was very moving that way, even for somebody who likes the numbers. And I can see if you're not so into numbers and charts, it's be way more compelling. Now, you have to be careful that it's a representative story. So if this was a play that was sort of about something that happened to 2 people, rather than millions of people, then that would be distorting, which is why you need to be careful about the facts. Right. But I can see why having the stories can be so important. Tell me, Jon, how you think about people that you're looking for. So part of what I think chiefs of staffs do is to identify people who might take senior positions or identify people to be entrusted with certain responsibilities. So without naming specific names of people you liked or didn't like to work with, how did you think about who you should recommend as Secretary Kerry to take on some assignment or some job or not to to do that?
Well, I won't recommend or give specific names, but I will say I don't know that I did a lot of things well as chief of staff, but one thing I really do feel like I did well was built a good team and hired people that were just fantastic. And the reason I say that is because that makes literally all the difference. If you can bring in people who are smarter than you, better managers than you, understand policy better than you, it will make you better, it will make the whole enterprise function better. So what do you look for? I would say a few things. One is particularly in a government job in which your ability to get things done is going to depend 100% on your ability to work with other people. You cannot be a sort of sole proprietor of a policy in the US government. You have to be entrepreneurial, you have to be out selling it to other people in your institution, in the interagency. So how people interact with other people is almost as important, I would say probably as important as their sort of intellectual horsepower. You obviously want people who are smart, but almost everybody crosses that threshold. You need people who can actually deal with other people as well. Low drama, low ego is a huge plus. That's a hard thing to assess in a job interview, but that's why there are things like references and
particularly for people who are ambitious in many senses and very, very hardworking.
Right.
To also be willing to step back.
So I'm a believer that ambition is a good thing as long as it's channeled towards the mission and less towards sort of the advancement of that individual. And it's an important distinction. And again, another thing that's kind of hard to pick up on until you actually know people a bit better. Frankly, I am less interested in expertise on a particular subject than I am in a track record of being able to kind of shift from one thing to the other and figure it out quickly and succeed. That probably comes from the fact that I was a journalist in which, the job essentially is to be an expert on one thing one day and a quasi-expert on the next thing the next day and then be able to quickly move on. So versatility, I think, is also hugely important.
Can you each tell me something you did that was hard in particular? I mean, both of your jobs were incredibly hard every day. But are there particular moments that when you were discouraged and kept going, or moments when you felt like you had risen to some particularly demanding occasion? I don't want to bring back
painful memories.
Post-traumatic stress.
I'll say when I started on Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2008 as a chief speechwriter, campaigns are they're so intense and they're so brutal and they're so relentless and 24/7. My first, I think it must have been 6 months, I was sort of the only main speechwriter, and it was just such a volume of speeches that at some point it just doesn't need to be good, it needs to be done. And I think to kind of set your ego aside and just get the thing done that needs to be done, that can be very difficult. And I just had to learn, you can't be perfectionist, you can't be precious. It just needs to get done. You need to get her what she needs to get and be done with it. I also say I think working on the First Lady's 2016 convention speech, that was just such a challenging speech. And I think she had such a vision for that speech. And I found it so hard I could see what she wanted, but I found it so hard to implement. I really struggled to kind of get her a draft, even though she'd very clearly laid out exactly what she wanted. It was kind of, for some reason, very hard to execute it. And it kind of came together finally late one night, but in those hours before it comes together, you don't know if it's gonna come together. You actually are kind of in this wilderness where it's could be great, could be disaster, I don't know. And I think those moments of uncertainty where you just don't know, they're hard. And a lot of, I think, success in politics is just muscling through them and also calling the right support that you need. I think that what Jon said about having people who help you out in politics, I could not agree more. I mean, that is just so critical. I don't make any career decision without calling probably 10 different people. And that is such a culture of DC political life where you have people who you call people up and they take your calls. If you've ever worked with them, they're gonna help you out. Anytime someone calls me, I'm gonna take their call. If they want some help, I'm gonna give it to them. I think that's something I really love about the political culture. So, I do think you have to kind of muscle through those tough moments and just marshal the support you need.
So I'd say two hardest things. There are many hard things over those years. One organizational and one substantive. The organizational one is when you make the transition in government, or probably outside of government as well, from being sort of expert/advisor, where your whole responsibility is to understand your brief better than anybody else and be able to answer any question on it or write a paper quickly on it, to having to manage other people and empower them and kind of bring them along too. There's nothing that really can kind of prepare you for that. You just sort of have to trust your instincts, get advice, and do the best you can. I made that transition during my time at the State Department. I found it challenging and time-consuming, but incredibly rewarding and valuable, and something I'm really glad I had the chance to do, but not easy by any stretch of the imagination. And then the other was the last year we were at the State Department, we started a process probably 14 months out from the end, saying, what are all the things that we want to try to do before we're done? What is the end state we're looking for on all these 10, 12, 15, whatever it is, big issues, and how do we get from here to there? Because we had a sense that time would start to feel incredibly short, and if we weren't rigorous about how we used it, there would be a million things left undone that we had hoped we'd gotten to, and things like travel, this stuff all has to be planned somewhat in advance. I think we did an okay job with that. We met regularly, we tracked progress, we did all the stuff that inevitably, though, there ends up being a lot that you wish you could have gotten to that you didn't, and so just trying to keep track of that process was a big challenge.
That's good. I asked that question not to put them on the spot, of course, but so particularly the young people in the audience understand that people do hard jobs. There are bad days. It's not that people, as incredibly talented and accomplished as Sarah and Jon are, they didn't have all the answers every day. Probably a lot of days you didn't feel like you had all the answers.
Any of the answers.
Yeah, none some days.
And part of what you have to do is you have to muscle through, as you said. You have to just keep going. And part of what I think I gained myself over my time in Washington was greater resilience, was a greater ability to have a bad day, try to learn from it, right? Try to take seriously what I did wrong that I could do better, but not get so weighed down by it.
Well, and frankly, failing multiple times every day and succeeding hopefully multiple times as well, and
right,
just being able to...
You got a lot of wins and losses
right.
in a short period of time.
There's also just a sheer physical endurance that I don't think I anticipated. It's not just the long hours, but Jon can speak with much more experience about this than I can, but just traveling for work. You were getting in and out of these dirty vans, and they're very, if you're a small woman, like you trying to leap up and leap out, and you're running after your principal, and you're trying to run on the plane, and you're sleeping at odd hours. It is very physically taxing. And I think I just never would have anticipated that. And obviously Jon had to travel around the world on a weekly basis, that, I don't know how you did it.
No, Secretary Kerry spent the equivalent of 130 days in an airplane during the 4 years he was Secretary of State. We traveled to 90 plus countries, almost 5 million miles. I think my first year in the job, I was on the road 200 days, all out of the country. So it does take a toll. But you actually, you get used to functioning with less sleep and probably functioning at a lower level, frankly. But it is what it is.
So let me ask one other question, and a set of questions, and then it'll be your turn. So you should get your questions ready. I want to talk about the last few months you were in the administration. My wife was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Economic Policy for the last 3+ years. So I saw a little of this secondhand through her eyes. I'm curious about it from your perspectives. I'm thinking about what did you say to the career staff? Because transitions are always unsettling for people, and this was clearly going to be a particularly sharp transition. What sorts of advice did you give or would you give to your successors? How did it feel personally to be on the outside after being on the inside for a long time?
It's funny, I was just recently rereading President George W. Bush's first inaugural, and I was just struck by how I felt like 90% of this could have come out of Barack Obama's mouth. I felt like I really agree with pretty much almost all of what he's saying here. It was such a beautiful articulation of core American values. And I think this translation is it's different, right? This president is just such a radical departure from any previous, Democratic or Republican president in recent memory. And I think that was very shocking, incredibly frightening, and incredibly jarring. But the Obamas made very clear to the staff that this was going to be a perfect transition, and that was our job. We had one job in the last few months, and that was to make a perfect transition. And I think we did that. We're very careful about what we said, how we carried ourselves, how we behaved, and how we prepared for the folks who come after us. So, I think, thinking about that was really important. You actually had another part of the question I wanted to answer. Now I forget what it was.
So I asked about the career staff. I asked how it felt for you to be on the outside.
Yes, that's what I wanted to answer. Everyone always warns you about that moment when you leave the White House and the gate clanks behind you. And so as I was sort of walking out on the last day, I was having this really soulful moment. And like one of my colleagues walked over and he was like, "Are you doing the walk? Are you doing it? Is this it?" I was like, "Oh man, this is my moment." So then I walking more, and then Cody Keenan, the president's chief speaker, he comes out. He's like, "Oh, is this it?" Like, all right, man, let me just do this. So I finally get outside the gate, clanks behind me, and it is. And then I crossed Pennsylvania Avenue, and they opened the barrier, and I went across that barrier. They closed the barrier, and I turned around. And I thought, like, for the first time in 8 years, I cannot get back into that building. I can't get back in. And for the last 8 years, I've a lot of your identity becomes intertwined in your ability to get in that building. Anytime, day or night, you can walk into that building, I can walk right by the Oval Office, and you lose that very suddenly. And it's jarring. I don't think most people leave a job where they actually can't get back in the door afterwards. It's sort of a crazy thing, and to suddenly have this sense of like, wow, I'm a citizen again. Like, this is it. It's both sad, it's a real loss, but there was also something kind of liberating about it, where I thought, like, I can say whatever I want now. Like, all right, I'm gonna enjoy this. So, ups and downs.
So I agree with everything Sarah said. One big difference between the State Department and the White House is that the White House is staffed 90+% by people who are leaving when the transition happens. The State Department is staffed 90+% by people who are sticking around afterwards. And as you said, this was an unusual transition. I mean, we had prepared for several months, series of policy memos and meetings that we wanted to have, and kind of briefings that we wanted to give the new team, and everybody wanted to meet with their successor, their new counterpart. And basically none of that happened. It was the decision of the other side that they didn't want that level of interaction. They were going to do things their own way. So there was some discouragement, I think, among everybody that things that we thought were valuable that we wanted to pass on were not going to be passed on. Then, as Sarah said, this is a different sort of transition. I think that is not a mystery to anybody here. But when you have a political workforce that's going to be kicked out of the building and not able to come back and has to look for a new job, and frankly that believed politically and in their sort of hearts, in many cases in the other side that lost the election, and then you have a career workforce that has to continue on working for the new team. It's just a very different set of challenges, and you have to sort of be careful about how you talk about it, because you can't. There might be one message that resonates better with one side, or one message that resonates better with the other, but you're talking to everybody all at once. So figuring out how to address various levels of anxiety, very divergent concerns, was a real challenge over the last few months. And what we did was try to have as much of an open door policy as we could to try to talk people through what was coming. Tried to help the political appointees to the extent we could figure out their next steps in terms of the transition. With the career workforce, our message to them was, frankly, your job is always important. It's incredibly important now because of the way this transition has happened. There has not been the level of kind of interchange that you'd expect. So your expertise, institutional memory, and knowledge is going to be incredibly important to the new group just being able to function once they get here. So want to support you in any way you can. On a personal level, I was so wrapped up in trying to make sure that the transition was smooth and trying to help my boss, who, by the way, was transitioning out of public life for the first time in 40 years, that basically all I had time to do was apply for this fellowship, hope it worked out, and get my stuff up to Cambridge. So I feel like on a personal level, just starting the process of figuring out what I'm going to do with myself.
Yep. Those are great answers. So I have more I could ask, but I want to give you a chance. So do people have questions?